Okay. So at the beginning here, for the audio record, I'll have you say your name and then spell it so that they can transcribe it
Do you want
correctly.
the whole name or just Neil Duddy?
The whole name, if you don't mind.
Neil Anthony Duddy. Neil Anthony Duddy.
Perfect. All right. And then at the beginning, we'll go through a little bit of your biography, a little bit of your background, and then we'll dig a little deeper into your
Okay.
past and your family. So, where and when were you born?
I was born in Butte in November 15th, 1943.
And did you grow up in Butte?
Yes, I went to St. Joseph's School, St. Mary's School, Boys Central for a little while, and then went to work.
What was your first job growing up?
Well, my first job growing up was a paper route, and then I set pens at night. So I would work till 10 or 11 o'clock setting pens at night, and then get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to deliver papers when I was 12 years old
Setting pins, did you say?
in a bowling alley.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Where,
they used to do that.
before the robot.
Before all the automatic stuff.
What was the bowling alley you worked at?
I worked at the Winter Garden. I worked at the YMCA, and I worked at the Anaconda. The Anaconda Company used to have a bowling alley on their second floor for their members, and
Did you become a bowler yourself?
I became a bowler myself. Yes, I bowled pretty good actually when I was younger. Yeah.
What's your claim to fame? Your top score?
279. My top score is 279. Had a lot of 250s and 260s. I never had a 300, but
That's all right. So what jobs have you had since that paper route? And
after the jobs I had were after the paper route. I went to work at Western Union, delivering telegrams when I was 16 years old, and I worked there for a little while, and then I went to work at Safeway, boxing groceries and stocking shelves. And let's see, then I went to work in the mines with my father when I was 18 years old. And I probably put 2.5 years in the Mountain Con mine. And then a bunch of us decided there was broader things, so we went mining, sinking missile silos up and around the eastern part of the state. And while I was up there, I got drafted. And so I went in the service for 2.5 years. Spent 13 months in Vietnam.
what division of the service were you in?
I was in the Army. I was a medic in the 101st Airborne Division.
It's a storied division.
Pardon?
That's a pretty storied division of the Army.
The 101st Airborne is a very storied, and we got a few medals, and we had some bitter battles, and so a lot of people died that shouldn't have.
Yeah. Are there any particular stories from that 2.5 years that you'd like to share?
No, no, you don't talk about that too much. I had a lot of great friends. In fact, I still have some friends from Vietnam that we get together, but it's something that you don't talk about too much.
Now, are you married?
Yes, I'm married.
And who are you married to?
My wife's name is Dorothy Sternod Duddy.
And what age did you marry at?
Well, this is my second marriage. My first marriage I probably married at 24 and was married for 25 years. And then Dorothy and I re-met. We knew each other from the time we were 12 years old.
Really?
And we met at a friend's funeral. And we were both divorced, so we started going together, and then we got married. We've been married for 20 years now.
And she is also of Irish ancestry?
No, she's English. It's tough to say, but
Fraternizing with the enemy there? Is that what
well, and not only that, she's from Cornwall, her family, and so we've been to Cornwall a few times too.
That's great.
We have to do both sides.
Sure. And you keep in touch with both sides of the family in Cornwall and in Ireland?
She keeps in touch with her family over in Cornwall. I keep in touch with my family quite a bit. We had, when I first started going to Ireland in 1995, we had 17 first cousins. I think we're down to 15 now.
And do you have children?
I have a son and a daughter by my first marriage. Dorothy has 4 children by her first marriage.
And what are their names?
My son's name is Neil Anthony Duddy.
It's a good name.
My daughter's name is Jennifer Marie Duddy, but now Robert. She's married now.
And do they still live around here?
My son lives in Kansas City, Missouri.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm moving there in a week and a half.
Oh, are you?
No kidding.
Oh.
Yep.
He went to school at DeVry, got his, bachelor's from DeVry, and then went to work and got his master's. So he's been out in the workforce for about 20 years now and doing well.
What does he do?
He works telecommunications and
Sure.
telephones, and
Very cool.
he works for an outfit out of Northern Ireland.
Really?
Yes, he does.
What are they called?
I'm not sure what his outfit is called now, but I could call you up with that. But
That's wild. That kind of came full circle, huh?
yeah.
Well, that's great. So when did your ancestors first leave Ireland from the States?
Well, let's see. On my mother's side, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-grandfather left Ireland in about 1883. And they landed in Minneapolis. And there was, I think, the whole Dugan family came over. There was like 4 brothers, a father, the mother, and the Cosgroves, there was like 4 of them came over. 3 girls and a boy. And as far as we can see, they all came together. And they all came out of Belmullet in County Mayo.
Okay.
We have their records, of their birth records, because that's about the only way you can get them is to go to the church.
Yep.
Now it's getting a little better, but at first you had to go to the church and you could look through the books and find them. And they were all baptized in the same church, the Cosgroves and the Dugans.
So
Go ahead. And my grandfather, John Nolan, came from Agawer, County Mayo, which is right out of Westport. And he came over in probably 1890. And he came directly to Butte. And he married my grandmother, Mary Dugan, and they had my mother and her brother.
He came straight to Butte. He didn't stop in America.
Yeah. Well, that's as far as we can see. He came right to Butte. We have found some things about him over here in Butte. But.
And what do you know about their lives in Ireland before they came over?
Well, we have met most of their families, and what's left of my great-grandparents, the Cosgroves and the Dugans. They live in a very poor part of Ireland, which is County Mayo. The only thing there is farming and fishing. And we suspect they left not too long after the potato famine, so they were probably the poorest of the poor. I don't know how they afforded to get to America, because I'm sure everybody shipped out of Cove when they left for America. My grandfather, I don't know why he came over here, but he came by himself at first, and then his brother, Pat Nolan, followed him. Actually, Pat left. His wife died in birth of the second child. So he left his first child with the grandmother, and he came over here. And they both lived in Butte till they passed away. Another brother-in-law of theirs that was married to one of their sisters, a McDonald, he came over about the same time, and he died in Butte of probably during the 1980 when they had the flu epidemic or the plague or whatever they had in 1918 here.
Mm.
My grandfather, John Nolan, got killed in the mines in 1939.
What was his job in the mines?
He was a miner, and as far as we can put together, he was climbing up a shaft with dynamite in his vest and a cap in there, and it blew him up. So his brother, Pat Nolan, lived until the 60s, and then he passed away here.
Was he a miner as well?
Well, he worked a little bit as a mine, but then he worked as a laborer mostly.
And how old were you when you started working in the mines?
18 years old.
And what did you do mostly?
Mine.
Yeah.
Well, I delivered timber to the stopes and raises, and then I went mining then because there was more money in mining. Day's pay back then, which would have been in 1961, was probably $19 a day. But if you mined, you could make as high as $50, $60 a day or more. So.
And what was the nitty gritty kind of like day to day of that? What kind of tools did you have available to you?
You always had a lamp and a light on your head, and you had drills, pneumatic drills, drilled with water, and then you had pinch bars to clean the stopes out after you blasted. But every day you would try to drill around and blast it. And then that night your partners would come in and clean it up, and the next day you'd go back in and drill another round and blast it.
And what did blasting involve at that point? Was it still drilling a hole and packing it?
Yeah, you would. When we were blasting, we would take one stick of dynamite with a primer in it, or a cap in it, blasting cap, and then you would put it all the way into the back of the hole, and that's where they get the saying imbued of tapper light. Because then after that, then you would blow the other powder in behind it. It was a smaller powder, but
because if you tapped it too hard, it'd blow up on you.
Well, it could. That's the possibility. It could, and in different places in the mines, they had electric blasting caps, where we just had the ones where you had to light a fuse, and they call that spitting your round. You'd light the whole round all at once, and it'd hopefully blow the way you wanted it to blow.
And did you have, it was the 60s, you probably had electric lights. You probably weren't working with a carbide lamp anymore?
We were working with battery lights.
Sure.
We had the battery on our hip, and the light. My father always told me that if you ever get in trouble down there and your light goes out, then get to the track and crawl out with your hands on both sides of the track. And you always thought, well, what is it if a train's coming behind me? Because they had little cars, and the guys goof off when they're driving the trains. But luckily, I never lost my light.
Good thing. What, it sounds like you've got a pretty rich Irish heritage and rich Irish background. What does your Irish ancestry mean to you?
Well, my ancestry probably means to me a lot right now. I don't think it did for most of my years growing up, because my father never talked about Ireland. I never met my grandfather. He was dead before I was born. And I don't know what it was about the Irish people, but they never talked about it. And I'm sure it was because their life was so difficult. And I know for a fact that my father, because I've talked to his brother, was out working when he was 6 years old, tending people's cows and sheep. And so he never had much of a family life. In fact, him and the one I was referring to, Pat Duddy, they were both out being farmed out to take care of somebody's cattle when their mother died, and they never even come and got them when their mother died. They didn't know until they got home that their mother had passed away.
And so when your family came over, they first settled in Minneapolis
For my
for your
grandparents.
grandparents.
Butte was for the Nolans, which would be my grandfather on my mother's side. But I suppose if I was to talk about a lot about my Irish heritage, it'd have to be my father, which was Neil Duddy. And Neil Duddy came over in 1929, the year of the stock market crash.
Wow.
He arrived in New York, I believe it's March something of 1929, and he was going to live with his uncle who lived in Roy, Montana. He had 80 acres that the government used to give the homesteaders. He had 2 horses and a cow, I believe. I've talked to people up there that knew both of them. But it took my father, we assume it took him at least 2 years to get from New York City to Roy, Montana. And so his life was hard even after he first came here. Everywhere he went, there were signs in the windows saying, "No Irish need apply." And we have no idea what he done. I know he rode the rails, he told us that. But I'm sure he found work along the way somewhere. I'm sure the railroad was always hiring people. And so, and they liked the Irish because the Irish were good workers.
Yeah. Why do you think there was that prejudice against the Irish people?
I believe it's because the earliest Irish, especially when they came to New York and produced their families, they grew up to be cops and firemen, and they had the good jobs, and so they didn't want them having the good jobs anymore. That's just my feeling, but
yeah, that makes sense. Are you doing that, Brandon? Okay. Great. Covered that. What do you know about? We covered it a little bit, but what do you know about the history of your family name, and has it changed throughout the years?
Our family name in Ireland is Duddy, and there is a lot of Duddys in Northern Ireland, around Derry and in Donegal, where my father's from. Even in Mayo, there's some. But if you look into an Irish book and you're looking for its surname, or if you're looking for your coat of arms, and you look up Duddy, it says C. O'Dowd. So somewhere back in the early years, I don't have any idea when, the Duddy name was O'Dowd. Who changed it, I don't know. But it's sort of funny because in Kansas City, they have an Irish pub that's called O'Dowd's.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a shirt from there. In fact, one of the glasses you guys are using got an O'Dowd sign on it.
Those are your people.
Yeah.
It's at some point or another, I'm sure.
My father never talked about it. You know, we don't know when it changed, and I'm sure they don't know when it changed. Because my wife is a historian, and she's got our family back to the early 1800s, 1841. And the name was always Duddy back then, so before then, I don't know when, but it evidently was O'Dowd somewhere in there.
Wow. That's great. Are there any traditional first names or nicknames in your family?
Well, my father had, I guess I'm not answering this like I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be repeating the question, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, there is a lot of traditional names in our family because my father's name was Neil. He was the eldest of his brothers. And then there was James, and then there was Patrick, and then there was Daniel, and then there was Patty. So just about every one of our families have a Neil, a John, a Patrick, if not in the first name, in the second name. And I don't know that we were called Dud a lot around here, but as a matter of fact, my wife calls me Fuddy Duddy, but let's not put that on tape. Huh? But yeah, all the names were pretty much the same, and that's even, I've met more Neil Duddys. My name is Neil. My father's name was Neil. His grandfather's name was Neil. His great-great-grandfather's name was Neil. So it seems like the eldest son was always named after the grandfather. The second son was named after the father, and so on down the line. I have one uncle over there that's passed away now. His name was Neil Duddy. And his grandfather, of course, his father, and my grandfather was John. So his first son was called John. His second son was called Neil. His third son was called Daniel, which was after himself. And then he had, his wife got pregnant again, and she was pregnant with a girl, and he said, but they didn't know that. They didn't do that back then. But she said, you're not naming this one after one of your brothers. And it was a girl, and her name is Patricia, after her Uncle Pat. But all the women's names were the same, too. Bridget and Margaret and Mary. And
Great. What's up?
Can we just turn your chair about 45 degrees towards Patrick?
towards this way?
Other way, opposite of that. Just like that. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, great. Do you know how your parents met?
That's sort of a confusing story. At first we thought my father, like I say, was living in Lewistown. And I don't know what he was doing there, but he had met and befriended a gentleman by the name of Ben Fisher, who was married to my mother's aunt. Her name was Katie Cosgrove. And they got married. My father stood up for Ben when they got married. And then we thought that my father, because Katie died in 1939, and we thought that's when my father came over here. But as we go back through the records, we find out my father came over here in 1937. And I'm sure everybody that you've talked to has told you, everybody took in rumors back in those days. And as looking up in some of the rumors, my father was rooming with my grandmother, which was Mary Nolan. And that's how he met my mother.
So Mary ran a boarding house of some
No, it was just an extra room she had to rent out, and her husband had died in 1939, but he must have still been alive when my father came over, so it was just, maybe he told him he knew Katie, which was their aunt, and that's how he got the room. But
I see.
But they got married. My mother and father got married in 1940. And being good Irish Catholics, there was 8 children.
8 children.
Which we're not doing good now because 4 of them are dead.
And do you know how your grandparents met each other?
I'm not sure how of course, on my father's side, they were all lived in the same Claddagh is where it was out of Churchill, Donegal. And I'm sure everybody, a lot of times you think they're all arranged marriages anyway, but because sometimes there's like a 60-year-old man marrying a 25-year-old girl, so you're not so sure they're not arranged. But I don't know that for sure. My grandfather evidently met my mother here in Butte. My great-great-grandparents had moved here from Minneapolis to Butte. And so there was 3 of them. And evidently she met John Nolan. As a matter of fact, John Nolan was a boarder in their house. And that's how he met my grandmother, and they got married. As a matter of fact, we found one little article that my great-grandmother was upset because my grandmother was too young to be married. She was only 16, and we're not sure she didn't lie about her age then, so she might have been younger.
Wow. That's great. So, you grew up in Butte your whole life?
I didn't stay here. I went to the service, of course, and when I come home, I worked at Stauffer Chemical, which is out here. It used to be out here, and it closed down. But I got a trade as electrician. So then I started moving, and I spent the last 28 years of my life in Missoula, Montana, working at Smurfit Stone Container.
Oh, sure thing.
Yeah.
I know it well. That's where I've spent my whole life.
Yeah. Well, in fact, my daughter, she still lives in Florence.
Oh, yeah.
Her and her husband and 2 kids live in Florence. But that was a pretty devastating thing when Smurfit shut down.
There's a lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs, good paying jobs. But luckily I retired. I retired at 62 and a half, so I retired a couple years before they shut down. But
Well timed. That was wisdom.
Well, I knew. I'm a firm believer in if you work 50 years of your life, you should be able to retire. And I went to work when I was 12 years old, and I never stopped working my whole life. So it was time to retire.
That's great. What was your childhood like here in Butte? What kind of memories do you have of that?
Well, our childhood was, like I say, there was 8 kids, and we finally moved up by the Mountain Con Mine on Summit Street, and we had a 3-bedroom house. One of the rooms wasn't much bigger than the restroom. So there was 8 or 9 of us, and then we always had extra kids staying there. We always had extra aunts and uncles staying there. My father was very generous with his house. The kids would have to pile into rollaway beds and stuff so my uncles and aunts could stay there. But our childhood was good, except we were like any family in the 40s and 50s and 60s in Butte. With 8 kids, it's tough to make a go of it. My father was a miner, a contract miner most of his life, and he made good money till he got hurt really bad. He was in a cave-in and broke both his legs and his hips and was off work for 2 years. So we'd done not a lot of things, but there's a place outside of town called Pipestone Hot Springs. I don't know if any of but it was like, that was our vacation every year. We would rent a cabin. They had like 10, 12 cabins up there. And we would rent 2 cabins, one for the girls and one for the boys and dad and mom. And it was a swimming pool and a mud bath for the older people. But it was really neat, and it was a good time. That was some of the good times. But, like I said, most of us had to go to work when we were 12, 13, 14 years old to help support the family. So there wasn't, a lot of us weren't educated, I think I had a sophomore. I went to a sophomore in high school. My older brother went to a freshman. He ended up being vice president of Western Union. I ended up being an electrician for 35 years and doing well. So everybody did their thing and worked, but there was a lot of times when there was nothing, and we ate a lot of deer meat. We ate a lot of mixed up meals. When you got that many kids around a table, and a mom and dad and an uncle and an aunt and a cousin or 2, then meals didn't go very far, but it was okay. We did fine. Yeah.
What kind of games did you play when you were a kid?
Oh, there was... Well, we lived up on the hill up in Centerville. We did a lot of sleigh riding. We did a lot of bike riding because you could go down the hill 100 miles an hour and then you'd have to push the bike back up the hill. But other than that, we played baseball. I played baseball. I played football. I played basketball. I kicked the can. And hide and seek. And there was always mountains around there. But we used to think were mountains, which aren't more than molehills. But we'd go exploring. And so, yeah, the younger kids probably had more time for playing than we did because we were all working.
Yeah. Did you ever, because the Columbia Gardens were probably still up and running when you were...
Oh, the Columbia Gardens were up till... The Columbia Gardens was probably it was a family thing on Thursday, you could ride the bus for nothing, and you could go out there and, you know, it's sort of funny because I can never remember, but for $1, you could probably stay there all day and have popcorn and pop and ride the rides, but I don't remember that too much. But at one time here in Butte, you could go to the movie theater for 6 bottle caps. That was the admission to get in. And a popcorn and a pop probably cost 10 cents. So, it cost your parents 10 cents to get rid of you for most of the day.
Wow. 6 bottle caps. What was
Pepsi bottle caps.
Did they reuse them or something? They recycled.
I think it was just a thing to get the kids to come to they had all those, back in those years, they had all those cereals like, Lash LaRue, and I can't tell you all of them, but Dick Tracy was always a big one. And so we got to go to the movies, but yeah.
That's great. Did you have any toys that you recall growing up?
Any toys?
Any toys, yeah. Or anything that you made yourself?
No, I never did make anything myself. So
sure. In all that, you were a pretty industrious little kid, starting work at 12. Did you have any time for hobbies or anything like that?
Well, like I said, I played baseball, but that was in grade school.
Mm-hmm.
I played basketball in grade school. We played Little League Baseball, which everybody done that around here. We had a lot of baseball teams around here. But that was, here she comes again. Oh, yeah. We all took boxing, of course, too, and we had a couple of guys. One guy taught boxing at the county jail, isn't it? So we all learned to box down there. I'm not so sure if that helped us or.
Well, yeah, you've all got a reputation of.
Well, Butte's got a pretty bad reputation for being a lot of fighting and.
Sure, I mean, there's a pretty. I suppose some of it's good though. I mean, not nobody wants to mess with anybody from Butte usually.
Yeah, well, back then it was, back in the day, or when we were kids, it was fun to fight because if you fought, it was somebody quit and that was the end of the fight.
Right.
And things got a little worse after, everybody knows that over the years. But Butte was always, it had its reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it seems like boxing used to be, it was more of a sport for a while, before it got to be, an out-and-out fight.
Yeah, and now they have this ring stuff. I don't even know what it's called.
Yeah.
Killing each other, I guess. but a boxing match, you had a referee in there, and he kept you from hurting each other. But now I'm not so sure this stuff they're doing now.
Yeah. Was there, do you recall any storytelling or musical traditions?
My father played the fiddle, and whenever he'd get a beer or two in him or a shot, he would get out the fiddle, and especially on St. Patrick's Day, he would always get the fiddle out.
What kind of songs would he play?
I'm not so sure he knew, but he played, I as I traveled later on in life, I found out he used to play at high school dances in Ireland. And he not only played the fiddle, but he played the little Constantine accordion. And I didn't know that until probably 10 years ago. Actually, this woman that I met over there that knew my father is the one that told me about that he used to play at all the dances. Then he moved to Scotland and evidently didn't play any more music, but he would get the fiddle out and play his Irish songs and sing his Irish songs. And
that's great. Do you remember any craft traditions or any hobbies that your father had?
Well, we all of us had hobbies, but we hunted a lot together. My father and my older brother and I, and maybe the younger brothers, we would bring home deer. We would get lost in the mountains for half a day or one time a couple of days. But my father was old before his time. And that's because he worked so hard all his life. And, I always think back to the time when I came home from Vietnam. My father was 62 years old, but he was an old man. It was hard for him to go. He would go uptown and he'd sit on the benches and talk to all the old miners and have his time. But somebody asked me when I turned 60 years old how it felt to be 60. And I said, it's no difference. Because for one thing, you never worked quite as hard as they did, for one thing. You exercise some, which they didn't have time to do that. My father worked 6 days a week in the mines, and sometimes 10, 12 hours a day. So there was no time, except for that pipestone thing with us. And he taught us all to swim. He had his own version of how he taught us how to swim. He would put a tube out in the middle of the swimming pool and throw us in. And that's the truth. And you would make it to the inner tube, or he'd jump in and get you. But that was always his way of teaching us how to swim. So
that's one way to do it.
But I always tell everybody these stories about my father, because my father probably never owned a car until he was in his 30s or 40s. And he was not a good driver. And back then we had those little 37s and 38s and 39s, and they were just small, coupé cars. And with 8 kids, it's sort of hard to imagine getting 8 kids into one car. And if they had to have seat belts for everybody back then, we'd have to tie them on the roof. but whenever another Irishman would come up to my father and want to learn how to drive, my father would try to teach him. Well, at times one of us kids might be with him, and it was a harrowing experience. My father was hard for him. But see, I don't think they ever drove anything but bicycles in Ireland, if they even had them. And yet, when my father turned 70, he went back to Ireland. This uncle that he had came to be with in Roy, Montana, Paddy McKay, had passed away and left my father some money. And so my father went back to Ireland and got to see 3 of his brothers and a sister after 40-some years. And they're telling me he drove all over Ireland, and I find that really hard to believe. Because I've drove in Ireland, and I don't know if... I don't know. I can't imagine. And that was in the 70s, so the roads weren't like they are now. There was none of these M5s, and, it was all the back roads, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So